Lubage mul tervitada president Arnold Rüütlit, kes on vahepeal meiega liitunud, aga järgmiseks ettekandeks ma annan sõna Amnesty Internationali peasekretäri ja administratsiooni juhile David Griffithsile. David, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is David Griffiths, and I am here from Amnesty International, where I'm based in London. And it's a pleasure to be representing Amnesty, a global movement of 7 million people in 150 countries, campaigning for a world in which human rights are enjoyed by all. And so it's great to be with you as practitioners, as fellow travelers in this journey promoting and seeking the protection of human rights around the world, and look forward to a day of stimulating discussions together. Now, of course, the next 12 months ought to be a time to celebrate human rights. Next year, we'll commemorate 70 years since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed, the birth of a framework that has given us much to celebrate. We should be talking about progress that has been made on a huge range of rights issues, everything from significant gains in women's rights to a major shift globally towards ending the death penalty. But instead, we find ourselves here to talk about whether the supposed decline of human rights in the world is reversible. We're focusing today on a very sobering question indeed. Are human rights in free fall? This is an existential question for all of us here in the room, for the whole human rights movement indeed. And in that I include not only NGOs and professionals, but all who are committed to this project, whether those in government or activist citizens as well. And I want to talk about two things in my time this morning. I want to discuss three key challenges facing the whole human rights project, challenges that I believe we will need to be effective in addressing if we are to confront the extremely difficult context that we face in the world today. But let me begin briefly by outlining the grim outlook we seem to face, a world where respect for human rights seems to be in steep decline. Now, Amnesty International has warned this year of a politics of demonization on the rise across the world. Leaders and popular discourses are portraying whole groups of the population as people we need to be protected against on the basis of their identity. Countries which once championed human rights are turning their backs. We see Denmark, one of the originators of the Refugee Convention, now questioning the very concept of the convention and asking whether the full spectrum of human rights really applies to refugees and migrants. Indeed, we see refugees caged in shipping containers on the borders of the EU in Hungary and sold at slave auctions under European noses. People defending human rights are paying a higher price than ever globally, suffering stigmatization, threats, judicial harassment, and even death. In the Philippines, strikingly, they're castigated as protectors of demons. According to frontline defenders, at least 281 human rights defenders, probably about the same number of people that we have in the room today, were killed in 2016. That number has doubled since 2015, and these are, of course, just the ones that we know about. Red lines seem to have all but disappeared in conflict. 2016 and continuing into 2017 seems to have been the time when the bombing of hospitals and schools went mainstream as a tactic of war. World leaders have been swift to embrace the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia despite his tightening a blockade which has prevented nearly all food and life-saving aid from reaching the starved and battered people of Yemen. Save the Children tells us that 130 Yemeni children are dying every day. Now, all parties to the Yemeni conflict, of course, have crimes to answer for, but Saudi Arabia has decided in its fight against Houthi rebels that the collective punishment of Yemeni civilians is an acceptable tactic in war. And of course, we've seen the ultimate consequences of a long-term, unaddressed demonization of a population in the campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya population in Myanmar. This is the cause, of course, of the world's fastest-growing refugee crisis. Now, this trajectory gives us many reasons for gloom and anxiety. It gives us reasons to ask whether human rights can truly make a difference in the world. And so as we prepare to mark 70 years since the Declaration, why are things seemingly getting worse? If human rights work, why are we not heading towards a better world? The great danger for human rights today is set out in Samuel Moyne's very memorable phrase in his recent essay on the future of human rights. He argues that its banal fate today is to be an ornament on a tragic world which they do not transform. Human rights, he says, express a beautiful utopian dream, but the biggest risk is that they prove incapable of delivering on that utopia. But the depressing trajectory that I've outlined need not, I think, push us to fatalistic conclusions. If we try to understand the nature of the challenge facing the human rights project, I hope we can indeed rise to it. And let's start by reminding ourselves of the reasons for human rights to exist, the ideals of justice, dignity, and equality. These are ideals which stand the test of time. While it seems that we live in an age of fear, of anxiety, of anger, of division, of bitterness, the human thirst for justice, dignity, and equality remains as powerful as always. And so the challenge, as Moyne frames it, is for a better compromise between the utopianism of human rights and the realism that we need to deal with the world as it is. So it's in that vein that I want to set out three big challenges facing human rights today, and to offer some ideas of how we can start to answer those challenges. The first is what I'll call the institutional challenge. What do we mean when we talk about human rights? Well, on one level, of course, we're talking about laws and standards, courtrooms and UN chambers, the legal provisions articulated in treaties and conventions which are admirable in the purity of their vision. Now, one of the best rehearsed arguments about the flaws of the human rights system is the lack of enforceability, the fact it relies on consent, on everyone buying into this system and its political significance. And the human rights movement often operates in a self-referential way within this rather clinical realm. But on another, more visceral level, when we talk about human rights, what we mean are the basic necessities for human flourishing which we demand for ourselves. The things we know in our gut to be true and right. The human need for justice, dignity, and equality. We have an instinct for these things. Human rights give a vocabulary and a form to these instincts. Now, perhaps we're guilty of having made the creation of a human rights infrastructure an end in itself. It is not. It is a means to serve the struggles for justice, dignity, and equality. And when we pay attention to the locus of these struggles, we see that they often have a visceral character and deep local roots. The support and the passion is local. The solutions must be found locally. And whether it's the movement against caste and gender discrimination in India, or the struggle for indigenous people's right to clean and safe water in Peru, or communities living with poor housing in the shadow of London's Grenfell Tower, there is an energy to local struggles that is somewhat distinct from the rarefied legal edifices of human rights. The language of struggles such as these may be infused with human rights, or it may not. But the content of them, I suggest, always is. So here is a disconnect, which I think was well described by the writer Pankaj Mishra, who suggested that human rights have become bloodless, too clinical, too divorced from the local struggles of people against injustice. And if human rights are to have a strong future, they must recognize and deal with this disconnect between the pure and the visceral. Rather than getting lost in ideological purity, the human rights movement needs to recover a rootedness in real communities. And so returning to Moyne, he writes that the success of the Human Rights Project will depend on its mobilizational strength, its grassroots penetration. In short, the human rights movement needs to get down and dirty. And part of that means a much stronger engagement with what is possible. The purist's version of human rights only gives us scope to criticize against idealized standards. But we must go further. We must be ready to design and propose new solutions. And so that leads me into my second challenge, which is about resonance. If the idea of human rights, the language of human rights, ceases to become relevant to people's experiences of life and how to improve it, there is little to expect other than freefall. Leaders have become very effective in deprioritizing human rights in the hierarchy of issues which concern ordinary people. They have peddled the idea that security and economic development trump rights, and often insist then that rights be restricted. Counterterrorism in particular has become a highly effective cover for limiting civil and political rights. When we see France, a cradle of the ideals which underpin human rights, making permanent several elements of its state of emergency, it legitimizes a securitization agenda everywhere that tramples over rights. Hard-won human rights, like the right to protest peacefully, are slowly being discarded. The same comes from the economic development argument. It's offered as a panacea. Look at the three-part solution which China announced that it had brokered on the Rohingya crisis. The first part is a ceasefire, the second a framework for returns, and the third economic development. No mention in there of dismantling the system of discrimination under which the Rohingya suffer, a system which we have described as apartheid. And in the face of challenges such as these, the public case for human rights needs to be made. Have we made it? Are we making it? Not, I suggest, when we focus on niche issues which appear remote to most people. And in particular, I think we cannot ignore the economic and social rights, which are often at the heart of people's anxieties about present and future. Rights like the right to work and rights at work, significantly impacted by automation and outsourcing now. Rights to housing and healthcare, rights to water and food. When we stand on a Greek island speaking about the rights of refugees who are enduring horrific journeys, but we remain silent about the plight of the local population suffering the consequences of economic austerity, do we then expect this to have no consequences for how human rights are perceived? It's time for the human rights movement to take more seriously the social and economic rights of people across the world. You cannot speak only of the right of a woman to protest about the land that has been stolen from her. You have to speak also about her right to ownership of that land. Now, the third challenge is about adaptability. Can a human rights framework provide answers not only to seismic political shifts in the world, but important technological ones which could fundamentally change our understanding of what it means to be human? Tech today is raising big new questions which human rights needs to confront. Now, Noah Yuval Harari's somewhat terrifying book, Homo Deus, offers us a glimpse of how far these challenges may eventually extend. A world where elite human and machine become increasingly entangled to a point where it becomes difficult to claim all humans are equal. As Harari argues, the liberalism in which human rights is rooted, the ideology of individual autonomy, may one day become moribund as we entrust ourselves more and more to algorithms. Genetic sequencing, health tech, and more could pave the way eventually for a supreme caste of humankind, supercharging today's levels of inequality. That's speculative and it's for the future, but there are challenges to grapple today, and human rights needs to supply answers to big new questions which tech is raising. And they include the realm of artificial intelligence. We already know that data-driven systems such as predictive policing and financial applications can entrench discrimination. Predictive algorithms are being widely adopted for law enforcement in the US and the UK and elsewhere. Combined with increasingly advanced facial recognition and the ability to track movements, tech is giving police unprecedented powers to track potential suspects seen as having the right characteristics to commit crimes. But when deep neural networks, which are inscrutable, are making decisions on whom to track, or when this data is eventually used to secure convictions or make parole decisions, there is no effective remedy anymore. So how far is too far as these decisions are being made today? It's easy to posit more challenges. Human biases can simply be translated into software under a veneer of supposed objectivity. Who is auditing the algorithms to which we're entrusting more and more of our decision-making? Truly, we've reached a fork in the road on these issues, and now is the time, I believe, for us to be showing how human rights can become a core design and use principle to ensure that artificial intelligence works for good. We can't presume to offer analog solutions to a digital world. Human rights as a system is calibrated to deal primarily with states and their obligations to citizens. But when social networks have the power to determine election outcomes, that's no longer the world we recognizably live in. Now, I've suggested that the crisis for human rights is twofold. It's a crisis of the world around us, a new dark politics of demonization which poses significant challenges to the causes of justice, dignity, and equality. And it is a crisis within the human rights movement, a set of challenges that we must confront if we're going to be an effective force for change. Martin Luther King said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." We need to hold on to that, but how quickly it bends, well, perhaps that is very much in our hands. Thank you.